All right. Welcome everyone again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series, a series hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're glad to have you join us today. I'm Dr. Anthony Perillo. I'm the Forensic Psychology Training Director here in the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. For the talk today, if you have any questions, you can enter them into the Q&A box anytime that you feel comfortable. We will reserve those until the end, and we try to get to as many as we can, but just forgive us if we can't get to yours. For those that want to stay for continuing education credits, you do have to stay for the full hour, but you don't have to stay longer than that. For those that are pursuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet in the chat shortly. For APA continuing education credits, those will be posted into the chat the last 5 minutes. A link for you to complete a survey. You'll need to open that link before you leave, and you'll want to save your certificate after you complete the survey because we don't keep copies of those. The recording and PowerPoint of these slides should be available to you in about a week's time. And next week, we will have Dr. Unnati Patel discussing the issue of color blindness in forensic evaluations. But this week, I'd like to introduce you to who we've been waiting for, the latest and greatest presenter of this UNM Law and Mental Health Didactic Series, who will be discussing identifying and evaluating defendants with mild intellectual disability. This is Ann Delpha. Ann Delpha is a staff attorney and adjunct professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law. Alongside Jim Ellis, she represents disability organizations and amicus briefs in United States Supreme Court cases on intellectual disability, most recently Hall versus Florida and Moore versus Texas. She teaches courses on mental disability and the law, and has taught about identifying and working with defendants with intellectual disability at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Funds Capital Punishment Training Conference and several federal defender habeas assistance trainings. She frequently assists litigators who have cases involved with people with intellectual disability and co-authored Evaluating Intellectual Disability, Clinical Assessments in Atkins Cases, published in Hofstra Law Review in 2018. And on behalf of the University of New Mexico, can I say how excited we are to have you join this presentation and to share your expertise. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm also happy to share what knowledge I have and answer your questions to the best of my ability. This is one of those topics that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm hoping that everyone here will get at least something out of this today. So I'm not the best with slides, but if nothing else, it'll provide a little comedy relief. My name and my address are here, and I'm assuming they'll share these slides, and you're welcome to contact me however you like if you have more questions later on. To get started, first question is, what's going on with the name? Intellectual disability, most people know this, but intellectual disability is the current clinical term for the condition previously called, and I hesitate to use this phrase anymore, but mental retardation. Why did we need a new name? Well, we can explain that. Because the terms that were once clinical diagnostic terms have inevitably become pejorative slurs over time. all of these were once clinical terms. Basically, the short answer to this question is that people are kind of jerks and they treat this particular population really, really badly. So we keep changing the name. So that's why we are now calling it intellectual disability. And we'll talk a little bit more about another name that turned up in the DSM-5 later on. So what's up with identifying people with mild ID? Isn't this pretty obvious? I mean, it seems, I know for a lot of folks, like this should be a 2-minute presentation and you'll be able to go on about your merry way. It's not quite that easy. People with mild ID in particular generally don't have distinctive facial or other physical features that are indicative of the disability. However, they often do have comorbidities, mental disabilities, other mental disabilities, including psychotic disorders, substance misuse disorders, anxiety, other mood disorders, personality disorders, all of this. Those often lead to diagnostic overshadowing, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. And third, and probably one of the most commonly missed features, and I hesitate to use that word, but features of mild ID, is that people with mild ID in particular often mask their disability from others, even when it's not in their best interest to do so. They will fake good even when people think, other people would reasonably think this person might want to fake bad. So most of us are thinking, yeah, but I already know when I see somebody with ID, they look like this. And yeah, some people with ID do absolutely look like this. But let me give you a pop quiz here. And I know you can't answer this. This works better when I'm actually in a room, but that's all right. Which of these people has intellectual disability? Yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm sure most of you are going, okay, lady, move on. Yeah, it's a trick question. They all do. Just so you know, Ella Darling and Alana Julian are the two ladies on the top left. They are two women in Australia who insisted on working outside sheltered workshops. They changed the face of intellectual disability and the treatment of people with ID in Australia. The bottom left is Freddie Lee Hall. He was the plaintiff in our plaintiff/defendant in Hall v. Florida, an Atkins case. The top center is Bobby Moore. He is the Moore of Moore v. Texas. The bottom center is Rosemary Kennedy. She was President Kennedy's sister, as many of you may know. This is a photo of her at her presentation at the Court of St. James when her father was the ambassador to the UK in the 30s before the war. On the far right is Lois Curtis. She recently passed away, an amazing lady from what I understand. She was the LC in Olmstead v. LC. That's the Supreme Court case that says the state can't warehouse people in institutions. They have to be provided community-based services when they are appropriate and accommodatable. So looking at all these faces, looking at all these folks, if you were standing next to one of them in the bus stop at the bus, it might not really occur to you that this is a person who might have ID, because people with mild ID usually look like everyone else. They look like a neurotypical person in the population. They don't generally have obvious physical differences. There is also generally no definite etiology for people with mild ID, although there are often identifiable risk factors in the person's history. Poverty, exposure to toxins, all sorts of things. But so what about people with Down? Well, those folks, the people that you saw in the first set of pictures, the very sweet smiling faced people, those people generally have moderate ID. So a few might be at the lower end of the mild range. They have a specific set of genetic mutations that create a fairly specific set of health issues and behaviors. They are pretty easily identifiable, but they generally don't have mild ID. Now, there are many other syndromes out there, Prader-Willi, Fragile X, FASD. They are generally less recognizable to lay people because the physical markers are often more subtle. But as a rule of thumb, people with syndromes tend to have more obvious physical characteristics of intellectual disability, and they also tend to have more obvious intellectual and functional difficulties. So the short answer here is that just because you see someone doesn't mean you can discern that they don't have ID because of the way they look. So what exactly is ID and who is telling us? Who's defining this? These are the most recent diagnostic manuals. As you can see on the left, it's the DSM-5 TR, familiar to all of you. It graced us with its presence in 2022. On the right is the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities most recent diagnostic manual. This dropped in 2021. Fewer people are familiar with this manual, and that is really too bad because it is an absolutely excellent resource. The DSM-5 TR has, I think, 5 or 6 pages. I normally have a copy next to me, but I don't right now. The AAIDD manual is an entire manual. It is an entire book. If you are going to work with, or you think you're going to encounter this population, I strongly encourage you to get the AAIDD manual. It is invaluable. The manuals are in general agreement. There are very few differences. We'll talk about the definition in a minute, but first of all, we have one more. What about this guy? This is the ICD-11, and it is responsible for the fact that when you look at the DSM-5 and the DSM-5 TR, they call intellectual disability intellectual developmental disorder. Well, why? What is going on with that? So the thing is that in order to get a billing code in the ICD, and as you all know, the ICD is what we all use for billing codes. The ICD is I think was originally created and is still probably largely run by folks outside the United States. But to get in the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, it requires that one has a disorder. So in order to get a billing code in the ICD, something has to be a disorder. If it's a disability, it goes in the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning. That's not the same, and it doesn't have the same billing codes. So bottom line, we need the billing codes. It ended up being called intellectual developmental disorder, and then in parens, intellectual disability. Now, there are people who are not happy about this. Some people in the community, in the disability community, are really not happy, and understandably so, because their argument is, hey, wait a minute. This is not a disorder. This is our normal. This is who we are. There is nothing wrong with us. We're just different. We do have a disability, but don't start acting like somehow we have some illness or disease. So it's fraught. But the bottom line is that all of these names refer to the same population of people and the same general definition, and that definition hasn't changed, at least not very much, in about, over half a century now. So this is the definition. 3 prongs. The first prong, significant limitations in intellectual functioning. The evidence for that is generally an IQ score of about 75 or less on a valid, reliable IQ test when IQ testing is possible. As a note, please don't rule out intellectual disability on extrapolations from poor tests or tests where the primary purpose isn't evaluating general intelligence, the Cattle-Horn-Carroll theory of intelligence. This is usually measured by 2 standard deviations below the mean score of 100 on most IQ tests. Most IQ tests, the mean score in the middle, we'll talk about this more in a second, is 100, and 2 standard deviations below is usually about 75, given the standard error of measurement, or 70 to 75, given the standard error of measurement. But there's more. Scoring badly on an IQ test isn't enough. ID also requires significant limitations in adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical skills. So what does that mean? It means that someone scores 2 standard deviations below the mean, again, on a reliable adaptive behavior instrument. It's always administered to others, usually not administered to the defendant, although there are a couple that can be administered to the defendant as well, but one should never, ever take the defendant's assessment of what he, she, or they can do alone. And then prong 3 is onset during the developmental period. The DSM leaves it as undefined. AAIDD recently raised the age from 18 to 22, but it is undoubtedly the developmental period. This is something that happened when the person's brain was still developing. So let's talk a little bit more about the first prong. Well, let's do that if I can. There we are. Advance the slide. So I swear, I'm not going to make you do math. I am not going to make you do statistics. It's not my forte either. I do not inflict cruel and unusual punishment. This isn't real math, and it's honestly not that hard. If I can do this, y'all can do it. This is just a bell curve. And a bell curve is just a visual representation of the distribution of scores in a population, or what scores should look like when tests measure what they're supposed to measure reliably, validly, over time throughout the population. This is a distribution of IQ scores, and it shows that most people score somewhere in the middle. Essentially, let's see, 68% of the population, essentially 34.5 plus 34.5, score somewhere just to the right or to the left of that mean line of 100. So essentially, most people score somewhere between 85 and 115, with most of them scoring as closer to the middle. So that line, that 15 points in either direction, is one standard deviation. The standard deviation is just another way of saying how far the numbers spread out from one another. If this curve looked more like a snake wearing a fedora rather than a snake that ate a sombrero, if the numbers were more spread out or there were multiple bumps, the standard deviation number would be higher, there would be more points. But as it is, once you start to get away from these center sections, this curve starts to drop off pretty fast. There are fewer people who score farther away from the center, so less of the population. Only 13.6% of the population has an IQ between 115 and 130 on the top end, and about 13.6% of the population has an IQ between 70 and 85 on the bottom end. So now we're still not to the section of people who have ID. To be eligible, not really the right word, but we'll call it eligible, for a diagnosis of ID, someone's IQ has to be 2 standard deviations below the mean, which on most IQ tests is about 70 to 75 or below. So now the people on the far right end of the curve, the people who score of 130 or higher, that's Mensa territory. Albert Einstein, Leonardo da Vinci, Stephen Hawking. Technically, the scale stops at 200 on that end, but allegedly there are people who have scored even higher. Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein had allegedly IQs of 160 to 190. It's hard to say because the closer you get to the edges, the less reliable the scores are. But they're not the population we're talking about today. So let's go back to the people who might have ID. Let's look at this tiny little tail. This is an expanded view of the tail on the left side of the curve. Statistically, it's about 2.2% of the population, but because of health anomalies, measurement anomalies, and because of just inherent imprecision in measurement, we think that people with ID account for somewhere between just under 2% to about 3% of the population, which is not a huge number of people, but for those people, it has a very significant impact. So this is an old classification for what used to be called MR, is now called ID, and I want to show it to you because I want you to understand why it's old. Why is this an old classification system? Because we don't use IQ alone to classify the severity of someone's disability anymore. Instead, we look at how much people struggle in their everyday lives, that second prong that we talked about and that I'll talk about more in a minute. We look at how much they struggle in their everyday lives and where they need help in order to classify them. So people still use these words, mild, moderate, severe, profound, but they aren't measured solely by IQ. Sometimes there's a pretty good match and sometimes there isn't in terms of what people can do versus how they score on an IQ test. So let's talk more about these last two prongs. Why are there two more? Why don't we just do this with IQ? Because we don't want to label anybody with ID just because they're a bad test taker. Being labeled with ID can be life-changing. It can create an incredible stigma, and it can be extremely problematic and traumatic for people. It can also be extremely necessary, but there are people who have learning disabilities, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia. They might be terrible test takers, but they don't have ID, because they don't have those serious, significant limitations in their daily functioning. So what are we talking about daily functioning? Well, we mean things like being able to read and understand a newspaper, or, well, okay, so these days reading a news online, being able to figure out a bus schedule, being able to make change, being able to read and understand the directions on the nukeable burrito that you just threw in the 7-Eleven microwave. It also means knowing how and when to wash your clothes, being able to figure it out if you come across a washer you haven't used before, understanding personal hygiene when it's time to wash yourself, Understanding personal safety issues. What do you do if you get a really bad cut? These are things that people who are eligible for a diagnosis of ID struggle with a lot. And they will have both an IQ score that's 2 standard deviations below the mean and a low score on an adaptive behavior instrument, an instrument designed to find out from them and, more importantly, from other people how well they can do these things. Basically, they're going to have serious trouble functioning in the world without any help at all. Now, to be eligible for a diagnosis, they also have to have the onset of the problem during the developmental period. This is mostly an etiology thing. It screens out people who had head injuries in adult or for whom something else was going on. Folks who do that, somebody who has a motorcycle accident at age 23 is going to have the same functioning problems as someone who had that motorcycle accident before they were 22. So it's absolutely understandable for etiology screening and research purposes. It's necessary, but it's not as if people who have adult injuries are going to have different problems, because very often, generally, they don't. Okay, so we've sort of covered the basics, but what is mild ID? So mild ID is kind of sneaky because it's a misnomer. People with mild ID are functioning about lower than just about 98% of the population in terms of their intellectual and adaptive behavior. This is that same little curve, but if you look, you can see that most people with ID are going to be up against that 70 to 75 number. They're at the wide end of the curve. So most people with ID have mild ID, and most people with ID aren't people you can just recognize right off the bat. So, and these folks, while they can function in the world without constant support, they're not out there with caregivers watching their every move. They do have pervasive deficits, and those deficits affect their ability to navigate some day-to-day situations and social interactions. So, what do you mean? What are we talking about? Navigate some day-to-day situations and social interactions. People with mild ID have strengths. They will have no external sign of the disability very often. They can read. They can read at a 6th grade and sometimes even higher education. So they may be able to read a newspaper or the news online, although they might not get all of it. They can write. They can have a conversation with you. How about them Mets? Oh yeah, that was a great sports balling last night, John. I thought so too. I mean, sorry, I have no idea. Sports ball is about the limit for me. So you would know that I didn't understand before you would know that they didn't. They can use some quote unquote big words correctly. They can draw. They have friends. They have romances. They will have appropriate facial expressions generally. So at least in common conversation, they're not going to be sort of looking at you with that, wait, what's going on look. They can have behavior problems. Just the same behavior problems that the rest of us have. They get impatient, they get tired, they get cranky. They may have been in regular classes in school. The school might have missed it. Special education in the United States is fraught. It differs from state to state, from district to district, and sometimes from within a district, even from school to school. Sometimes people who really need special education don't get it for a whole variety of reasons. Some of those reasons have to do with politics. Some of those reasons have to do with money. Some of those reasons have to do with stigmatizing children, particularly children who may be stigmatized already in other ways if they go to poor schools. There was a big and understandable flap about 40 years ago about mislabeling African American and to some extent Hispanic children who didn't have ID but didn't score well on tests. Again, because they weren't being given the appropriate education and the things that they need. But again, this is why we don't diagnose ID just from an IQ test. So they might have been in regular classes. They could have graduated. They could have graduated from high school. They could have played sports, might be a football player, would, again, know more about sports ball than me. They can drive a car. There was one gentleman I understood who can even drive a big rig. Now, he had trouble keeping the records, but he could drive. They can have quote unquote street smarts. To some extent, they can know how to function in a dangerous neighborhood. Usually that's from unfortunate experience and probably repeated learning, but they can sometimes do that. They can get a job, they can keep a job, they can work at McDonald's, in a laundromat. There's a lot of entry-level jobs that people with ID can do outside a sheltered workshop. They can operate machinery, and they can absolutely plan and commit some crimes. Now, I don't think that we're talking Ocean's 11 here, but simpler stuff, yeah, absolutely. They can plan and commit crimes. Just because someone has plotted something out doesn't mean they don't have intellectual disability. They can, just like most of the rest of us, lie, and they can lie sometimes pretty well. They generally do know right from wrong, and they can have umpty strengths that aren't on this list. If you're looking for more or a better description, the site that I've put here at the bottom, the Snell and Lucassen article, is excellent. There's also a site to the article I did with Jim Ellis that also talks about this. Don't be fooled by strengths, and don't let them dissuade you from looking further into someone's functioning. Don't just assume that because these things are true, this person couldn't possibly have ID. There's another thing that people with mild ID often have, and this is extremely common, and it's also extremely hard to recognize because we don't really have a test for it, at least not at this point. They're kind of unmeasurable, and it's essentially social functioning deficits, gullibility and naivete. People with mild ID almost invariably have these issues. They will often believe things that are said by others that a quote unquote average or neurotypical person would immediately suspect as puffery, exaggeration, or outright lies. As a result, people with ID are often suspected of willful blindness because an evaluator or a lawyer will think, nobody could actually believe that story. Well, actually, yes, somebody could, and somebody may really have believed it. They often have unrealistic or naive beliefs about the world that sound contrived or literally unbelievable to neurotypical people. I know that there was a man once who had been convicted of some very serious criminal charges. He had an intellectual disability. His attorneys managed to get him a retrial, and they asked him, as they have to do because this is always the defendant's decision, they asked him if he wanted to be tried by a jury or by a judge. Now, keep in mind that the judge had already essentially signaled that if he retried this man would be found guilty again and sentenced to death. So one would think that this was a pretty easy answer. But the gentleman had problems. And he said, gosh, that's a tough one. And he kept saying, that's a tough one. And finally, and I just have to, Ruth Lucassen, who was brilliant, finally asked him, well, why? Why is this such a tough question? And he said, because the jury's going to be very angry at me. And it took her more questioning, but she finally figured out that he really believed that the same jury who had been in the box several years before, the same 12 people they were still sitting in that box, and they had been stuck there all this time, and they were going to be really, really angry at him. And so he wasn't sure if maybe he would be better off taking his chances with the judge. This is the kind of quote unquote unbelievable idea that people with ID can have. And this is sort of where they wobble in the competence area. Are they really competent? Well, I mean, he understands what a jury is, but he didn't understand that they go home at the end of the case. And these are questions that, as you're doing your evaluation, you need to be really aware of. Another thing that people with ID don't understand, they don't understand how things can change in context. They often don't get that people's ideas change, people's loyalties change, and they themselves don't adapt to changing circumstances very quickly. So as a result, they will often lose the race to the courthouse because they don't understand that their co-defendant isn't going to be loyal and will in fact blame them for things that the co-defendant did. They will hang on to the loyalty of other people or rely on the loyalty of other people to defend them or even to tell the truth when those other people are not going to do that. Ultimately, the point here is that intellectual disability is a condition, not a number. This is a quote. Justice Kennedy wrote it in Hall v. Florida. These are people. They run the gamut of human beings just like the rest of us, but they do have this unique set of difficulties and problems that we need to be aware of. So what? Even if I don't know right away, aren't I going to notice this pretty quickly in an eval? I mean, you've told me all this, it's great. Aren't we done now? Well, sadly, no, because people with mild ID and people who aren't self-outed by their facial features, people who don't look like they have intellectual disability, people who don't have Downs or even some of the other syndromes, those folks often still have other problems. They have other issues that overshadow their intellectual functioning difficulties. To compound things, they often work really, really, really hard to disguise all of their problems, but most especially the intellectual disability issues, because they've learned through a lifetime of abuse that being quote unquote dumb is responsible for every bad thing that has ever happened to them. People treat them badly or worse once they figure it out. They use them, they abuse them. The girlfriend they lost, the apartment they lost, the job they lost, the reason that dad hit them more often than any of the other kids, their understanding, and sadly they're not wrong about this, is that it happened because they were dumb. And so if they just don't show people that they're dumb, and this is their word, not mine, I don't call people that, if they don't show people that weakness, they'll be okay. And because of the way they're treated, there is often more than a little self-hatred involved as well. This is trauma. This is the hiding and the masking is a trauma response. And we will talk more about that shortly. So what about dual diagnosis, comorbidity? So people with ID, as I was just saying, they've often experienced extensive abuse for their quote unquote stupidity. Again, the words that they're going to hear, not mine. But they often have trauma issues and they have resultant mental illness problems because of it. PTSD, anxiety, addiction, other abuse issues. These are rampant in this population because on top of everything else, they are also often very isolated. They often don't have a lot of friends. They don't have a lot of peers. They have people who may support them. They may have people who prey on them, but they have a hard time finding their own social group. People that they can relate to. They often hang out with younger people, which sometimes doesn't end so well for them. People with ID also have a higher incidence of other mental illnesses that are not necessarily trauma-induced. Schizophrenia, depression. Why? The short answer is we don't know. The longer answer is it may have something to do with the organic problems that also cause the intellectual disability. It could be, there is some evidence coming out that even schizophrenia is to some extent related to stress, an epigenetic issue, that there's a predilection for it that can be released when people are subject to constant stress. What makes it worse is that these mental illnesses don't manifest in precisely the same way in people with ID as they do in the general population. So, fortunately for all of us, and I mean that sincerely, there's another book. The National Association for the Dually Diagnosed, NAD, has created the Diagnostic Manual - Intellectual Disability. It is a textbook, as they say, of diagnosis of mental disorders in persons with intellectual disability. They're on their second edition. It just came out in 2017. The first edition was also excellent. And for reasons I'm not entirely clear on, there are some things, well, obviously there are some things in the second edition that aren't in the first, and that makes perfect sense. I'm not quite sure why there were some things that were left out of the second edition that were in the first. I would very strongly recommend, again, if you're going to work with this population, and if you're evaluating people in a criminal context, you're working with this population, whether you know it or not. I would very strongly urge you to go find both copies of this book. They are really, really helpful. They explain things clearly, and they will give you a leg up on figuring out what is going on with a defendant when you're trying to evaluate someone and nothing is quite fitting the way it ought to. This may very well be why. So, because that wouldn't be enough, there's more. Diagnostic overshadowing. Now, the most common form of diagnostic overshadowing occurs when someone's disability masks or is just attributed to be the cause of a real medical problem. This happens a lot in people with more severe forms of intellectual disability, particularly if they're nonverbal, they will start acting oddly, or at least oddly to their caretakers. They'll start acting in ways that their caretakers don't recognize or that aren't usual. And the caretaker will know, okay, something is going on. This person is having a stomach ache, or is constipated, or has a toothache, or a headache, or something. And that's the problem, is sometimes it's really hard to tell what's going on. So they take the person to a doctor or a nurse practitioner or whatever. And if that person isn't versed in ID, they will often blow off the caretaker and say, oh, no, that's just the disability. People with disability just act like that sometimes. So that's one problem. That's not a problem you're likely to see in people with mild ID, because they are verbal. They can generally tell you, my stomach hurts, or I have a toothache, or whatever. However, in people with mild ID, their mental illness or other comorbid condition can mask the fact that they have ID. It's a different kind of diagnostic overshadowing. Essentially, if you have some, and this happens a lot when people are children and in school, if the kid is running around setting things on fire, people notice that, amazingly. I'm sure that's a shock to all of you. They may not notice that what else is going on with this kid is that they're having some serious problems in school. Or if they do notice that they're having academic problems, they attribute it to the mental illness. They don't realize that there's something else happening. So that means that you can see someone with ID who has some serious behavior problems, who has never been diagnosed with ID. And if you don't catch it, nobody may catch it. And we'll talk about why that's a problem later on. But please, please keep diagnostic overshadowing in mind. It happens a lot. As sort of a lovely add-on to diagnostic overshadowing, we have the cloak of competence. So first of all, this is not competence as in the legal term of art. Competence to stand trial, competence to testify in court, competence to sign a contract. I'm not talking about that kind of competence in this context. This is competence in the vernacular sense. It's competence to function independently in the world. These are two books. There's the original and then the revised and updated edition written by Robert Edgerton. Dr. Edgerton was an anthropologist, and I found this fascinating because he was an anthropologist who did a study of people who were deinstitutionalized in California in the 60s. I think these folks were coming from Lanterman, but I'm not sure. Anyway, he'll tell you if you'll read his book. He and his grad students basically just asked these folks if someone could follow them around for a while and hang out. And many of them said, sure. It's interesting in some ways that they said sure, and if you think about that, there are a multitude of reasons, not the least of which is loneliness. The result of these studies is two books, and they showed that pretty much to a person, people with ID did everything they could to avoid disclosing that they had ever been in an institution. I mean, anything. They also did anything they could to avoid disclosing that they were, in their vernacular, not mine, dumb. When confronted with the gap in time regarding their time in an institution, basically, well, wait a minute, where did you live between 1964 and 1967? Many of them said, oh, I was in prison. Because to them, being a felon was less stigmatizing than being known as, quote unquote, having, well, I'm just going to use the R word because I hate this word. Even though it was clinical, I hate this word. But being a felon was less stigmatizing than having ID. Realize that part of this, a big part of this, is not necessarily a deliberate choice. This is at least based in a flinch. It's a knee-jerk reaction, and it is a deeply ingrained self-protection mechanism. It's defense against you, and it's a denial of the truth for themselves because they don't want to be what they think is this awful person. They don't want to be dumb, stupid, unreliable. I mean, that's a too big a word probably, but they don't want to be, and it's awful because these people have basically been taught to hate themselves pretty much from earliest childhood. And it comes out sideways in some pretty awful ways. And there are plenty of worse things in the world than being not so smart. But that's not what these people learned. And that's not how these people live. And so they are defending themselves the best way they know how. And they are going to do that in a variety of ways, and we'll talk about some of them now. They're going to mask. So what is masking? It's the exaggeration of abilities, first of all. They will tell you about jobs that they never had, things that they never did, schools that they never went to. I recall one gentleman who was ultimately sentenced to death because he claimed for many, many years that he was a riverboat pilot, and this was in the South. And many people know that you have to be pretty smart. You have to pass a multitude of tests to be licensed as a riverboat pilot. Well, he never actually was, but his trying to exaggerate his abilities years before cost him dearly in later years. But in addition to exaggeration, there are other techniques. Dissembling. People, basically, they won't answer a question, or they'll pretend to answer it, or they'll go around in a circle and do anything they can not to answer it. They'll use big words that seem appropriate. They can be really, really good at parroting back or speaking back legalese. If you ask them about the indictment, they may very well use the word indictment. However, if you ask them what an indictment is, they won't be able to tell you. They can also bring up words that they've heard maybe from their lawyer in conversations. Sometimes they use those words correctly. Sometimes they're a little off. That might give you a clue. But getting people to answer in their own words, don't rely on the fact that just because they use this word means they know what it means, because they may very well not. Distraction. If they can't dissemble, they'll distract you in another way. Humor. They'll make a joke about things. Oh, I don't know, that's a tough one. Another way, particularly children will do this, is with misbehavior. They're frustrated. They know they're in trouble. This happens a lot in school. You'll see kids who have a lot of behavior problems, or people who have a history of a lot of behavior problems, because they know they're quote unquote in trouble. And they also know that they have absolutely no idea how to fix it. They don't know what they did wrong, or they don't know what's wrong in their answer. So they panic and they lash out. And it has the side effect of not showing people that they are quote unquote dumb. Again, the community's word, not mine. Adults will sometimes do the very same thing. It worked for them when they were kids. It will work now. Adults can act really, really scary. Sometimes they can actually be really, really scary. They will act very scary and menacing, and they are doing it, at least unconsciously, as a way to protect themselves from being found out. Now, that doesn't mean that these folks are teddy bears and that if you push them, they are not going to get very upset and possibly lash out. I'm not telling you that at all, and I would never tell you to do anything that's not safe. I'm saying if you have someone who starts getting agitated every time you ask them a question to which they don't seem to know the answer, it may be an indicator that there is something else going on, that intellectual disability may be an issue. And the last way that these folks mask their disability is through, or one of the last ways, through hidden supports. People with ID can be really good at getting other people to help them out. They will get the clerk to count back their change by saying, oh gosh, I forgot my glasses. Now they may have forgotten their glasses 25,000 times. They may never have had glasses, but they know if they say that, most people will go, oh, here you go, and count back their change. They often also have family members or friends who do hard stuff for them. We see this a lot in cases where a lot of mitigation has been done. Someone will have a job or even a little business, and people will say, well, he couldn't possibly have an intellectual disability. How could he do the books? Well, the answer to that is he didn't do the books. His wife did the books, or his kid did the books, or his cousin did the books. Or he worked at a business that required him to go places, and a kind coworker would map out where he was supposed to go every morning, or even give him turn-by-turn directions as he was going along. This can happen even in prison. Prison inmates will often cover for another inmate, whether they're doing it consciously or not. They help with canteen requests. They help with letters. They will write a very sweet and lovely letter to someone's significant other, and then the person in question will recopy it in their own handwriting. So what you end up with is a letter written in the defendant's handwriting that looks as if this person went to and graduated from college. They couldn't have possibly written this on their own. Well, the answer is they didn't. But if you don't look, you'll never know. And one of the corollaries to this kind of hidden support problem is that sometimes these supports aren't so supporting. The need for these supports and looking for them makes folks with ID really, really prone to being taken advantage of financially, because they just hand over a paycheck or hand over a wad of cash or hand over a letter and say, I don't know what this is, can you help me out? To people that they trust. Another little thing, it's not so little, but it seems little because it's subtle and you won't notice it unless you're looking for it: suggestibility and acquiescence behavior, otherwise known as socially desirable responding, yes saying. In essence, a yes or no question will usually be answered yes, even if the correct or real answer is no, and whether the person knows the real or correct answer or not. It doesn't matter. I mean, I believe one of the tests that they did, one of the studies, asked the question to people who were born and living in the United States and were Caucasian, are you Chinese? And the answer was generally yes. There are several reasons for this. It's people pleasing. It's trying to go along and get along. It's trying to not be found out as not knowing the answer. It's also trying to be friendly and have friends and fit in with the group. It works because yes is usually the quote unquote right answer. Generally, when we ask someone a yes or no question, even unconsciously, we're looking for a yes answer. Are you too cold? Are you hungry? Yes is usually the right answer. And if you're really lost, yes, saying yes will make people move on. So avoid closed-ended questions whenever possible. Don't just ask a yes or no question. And the other problem with asking a yes or no question is if you do, the person is now going to have the words to answer you. So if you ask them, were you indicted? They may say yes. And then a few minutes later, you may ask them about something and they'll say, well, that was the indictment. Now you've given them the words that they need. You avoid closed-ended questions, avoid leading questions, get them to answer in their own words whenever possible. Another issue here is suggestibility and outer directedness. People with ID are exceptionally suggestible. This is particularly true in situations where there's a strong power differential. So if they're in a room with an evaluator, a doctor, somebody who has a degree, they are more likely to respond to leading questions and mild correction than neurotypical defendants. It's part of that go along and get along, skate under the radar, be safe, protect yourself, people-pleasing masking. They are also often overly reliant on others. They will look for verbal or even nonverbal cues provided by others, but they're not so good at realizing when they are being led astray. So if you ask a question and somebody is nodding yes, somebody with ID, even though they oftentimes have trouble with some things like this, they've learned over time, they'll pick up on those verbal cues of what you want them to say. And they will then say it because they want to make you happy, because they want to be safe. This has led to multiple false confessions, wrongful convictions. It's really bad. And the problem is a lot of people don't know what's going on. And so then you have somebody who has confessed, and it's very hard to convince people that anyone would ever confess when they didn't commit a crime. So one of the last things I want to talk about is malingering, otherwise known, at least in lawyer vernacular, as faking it. I know that most clinicians don't call it that. People with intellectual disability are far more likely to try to fake good. They will try to inflate their abilities than to malinger or fake deficits. And this is true. This is totally counterintuitive, but this is true even when they know, or at least they're told, that it's in their best interest to show how impaired they are. When they're charged with a capital crime and they could be spared the death penalty if they were found to have intellectual disability, when found being incompetent might keep them from being tried at all, these folks are generally not going to try to exaggerate their problems. They're still going to try to mask them. And it's that same trauma flinch. They're going to do this because it's what they've done all their life, and it's not conscious, and it's tied to their amygdala and emotional safety, and they're not going to give it up very easily, if at all. So don't assume that this is what's going on, because in all likelihood, it isn't. So, a few last comments and then questions. Best practices for identifying people with ID and in evaluations. Please never ever use a lack of distinctive physical characteristics to rule out ID. You can't just do it by looking. I think we've explored that immensely by now. Never use isolated strengths. Just because you see someone who held down a job, who can read, who can do all of the things or other things on that list, that doesn't mean they don't have ID, and it doesn't mean you should stop looking. Please conduct cognitive testing whenever it's possible or feasible. You really need to know this information. Please also note, effort testing can produce false positives in people with ID. The test incorrectly says that they're not giving good effort. This happens because there aren't a lot of effort tests out there that were normed on people with ID. And so people with ID kind of mess up the test. And if the test wasn't normed for them, you really shouldn't be using it on them. Additionally, consider adaptive functioning issues when an IQ score is in the ID range. If you have an IQ score in the range, start looking at how this person functions, and don't just rely on them to tell you. They may mask. They almost certainly will mask if they actually have ID. Look at other things. Look at records, look at school records, look at other objective indicia of what is going on. So, and be aware of those masking behaviors. Don't be fooled. Look for social functioning deficits. Don't assume that a defendant who tells you what seems to be a fantastical narrative, like that jury's been sitting there for 2 years, they're not trying to fake you out. If they were trying to fake you, well, people with ID can't fake very well either. They don't tend to fake bad well on the very rare occasions when they do try it. But most people who are going to fake are going to try to fake it better than that. Avoid close-ended or leading-ended questions, even nonverbal cues. Ask for an explanation in the defendant's own words. Be wary of diagnostic overshadowing with comorbid mental illness. And finally, please use convergent validity. Look at all the exam of the available records. Look at everything. Look at the testing. Look at collateral sources. Talk to people if you can do that. See if past indicators about intellectual and adaptive functioning are consistent. ID is constant. It is not like mental illness. It's not episodic. It doesn't come and go. If this person was struggling in the 3rd grade, they are probably almost certainly struggling now, particularly if it was bad enough for them to be put in special education and to get some kind of a diagnosis. Why does this really matter in the context of an eval? Honestly, because if you don't catch it, nobody is going to catch it. You can accidentally and unknowingly lead someone down a very false path and incorrectly conclude that they're competent when they aren't, or worse, that they're faking being incompetent when they really don't meet the Dusky standard. Also, you may have a situation where an attorney really needs to know what's going on with their client, but they don't see it because they are not trained. They are not you. They might know something is going on, but they may not know what. They're definitely going to be fooled by the diagnostic overshadowing. And so even if the client is nominally competent, he, she, they will go on through the system at a constant risk of being or becoming incompetent if things go too fast or if they get complicated. These clients might be titled, even if they meet that very low Dusky threshold, they may be entitled to additional assistance under the ADA. They might need additional evaluation or mitigation, but if nobody realizes they have ID, they are not going to get that help. They will go through the system unnoticed. They may even be wrongfully convicted. All right, I think I am just about at the end, essentially, of my slides. Are there questions, concerns? I'm sure there are wishes to flee at this point.
Well, thank you, Anne, for a very engaging presentation there. I do have a lot of questions here in the audience. I'll try to navigate so we can spend about 10 minutes going through some of these. One question that came up here at the end, I think it was around the time talking about some impression management. This is more about third person impression management, about how do you suggest evaluating adaptive functioning talking to collaterals, interviewing family members who may have a reason to downplay an individual's functioning?
That is a really, really good question, because people in families often do have exactly that motive. It may be because they're circling the wagons. It may be because they have emotional trauma or guilt issues over maybe not noticing or not being the kindest or most wonderful family member. And another reason to watch out for is that ID does sometimes run in families. And so you will get you will talk to mom or dad or sister who will say, well, there was nothing wrong with him. And compared to everyone else in the family, that's absolutely true. Compared to the general public, it might not be. Honestly, this is one of those things that the best thing I can say is to reach out to a mitigation specialist. There is a lot of training that's out there for doing this, but it's not something, it's kind of hard to give you in 2 seconds or less. I'm also happy to talk to anybody afterwards and reach out and give them more resources. I think the best thing I can say in the short term is kind of the same as you would do with the defendant. Don't lead. Don't ask, gosh, do you think this person might have ID? Because that's going to get people's backs up. Just ask, what was going on? How were they? Tell me about them. Tell me about their childhood. Did they meet their milestones? Or what, even better, when did he first learn to walk? When did he first learn to talk? Those kinds of things. Leave it open so that you don't necessarily indicate what you're looking for, which will make it a lot easier for family members to give you real answers.
As a follow-up to that, how about assessing for adaptive functioning for people that are incarcerated where you don't seem to have access to family support or reliable records? And would it ever be appropriate to potentially use a scale like the Vineland with unit staff that are there on the unit with the person?
So this is absolutely a huge problem. And it's really a problem when you have someone who's been in prison for a long time, because a lot of the people outside who may have been able to tell you about their community function might not be there anymore. I mean, might have died, moved, disappeared, whatever. Generally, my understanding is that you don't use you don't use adaptive behavior instruments in prison, because the problem is prison is an artificially supportive environment. And so the Vineland isn't really going to give you any good information, and it's probably going to exaggerate what someone can do, because most of their abilities most of what they're doing is already kind of being chosen for them. You know, they are being told what to go, what to wear, what to eat, when to sleep, when to shower. I mean, everything is regimented. And the other thing is that adaptive behavior instruments need to measure what was going on with someone during the developmental period. And unless this person, even if the person was incarcerated during the developmental period, that's not whom you should focus an adaptive behavior instrument questionnaire on. But you really shouldn't do it when you're trying to, essentially, it's a retrospective evaluation, and it needs to be done outside the prison context.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely vital there. Several questions have come in related to this, these questions about assessing for symptom validity and response bias, and just asking more generally, are there particular instruments or approaches that you do recommend to assess for this for people with suspected intellectual disability?
So effort testing, and that, I'm sorry, I think that's no longer the correct term, and I apologize. I've forgotten at the moment what is the correct term. I am not sure there's anything that has absolutely been validated on people with ID. I know there are some tests better than others. Off the top of my head, I don't recall what they are. I know there are a couple of good articles out there, and I'm actually happy to follow up with the citations. But off the top of my head, I can't remember. This is one of those where it's mostly be careful, and if the test hasn't been validated on people with ID and there are no studies, I mean, I can give you the negative, be very, very wary of tests where that is the situation, and look at all the studies yourself first and see what you see.
Do you have any suggestions for explaining to people in the court how someone with intellectual disability could possibly engage in what would seem to be sophisticated criminal behavior while also presenting psychological mitigation about intellectual disability?
Woo. I think that, I mean, the thing about quote unquote sophisticated criminal behavior is it all depends on what you mean by sophisticated. Again, like I said, if there is an Ocean's 11 situation going on, someone with intellectual disability is going to be the patsy. They are going to have been the person who was brought along and left behind. Short of that, people with intellectual disability can plan they could plan a robbery. They might not be able to plan it all the way through. They might do some not so wise things in the middle. But what I would also look for are hidden supports. Look for the people who may have helped them. And that can be problematic because it can be a co-defendant who is certainly not going to say, oh yeah, that was actually my idea. Or it could be someone in the community who doesn't want to be associated, unindicted co-conspirators, that sort of thing. But I think that explaining what people with mild ID can do fits in with the crime. And also it's really difficult just in terms of using the facts of a crime is generally not such a good idea anyway, because part of this is because you never quite know how things happened or who helped or what was going on. And so it's kind of fraught, but that's the best that you certainly can't use the facts of a crime to rule out ID, because there's usually something going on underneath. Not sure if that was helpful.
I think it was. Thank you. Yes. This question has a little bit of a setup, so I'll try to summarize here. The context here is at this person's agency and state, they require extensive documentation of IQ and adaptive functioning before age 22 in order for people to qualify for services. And sometimes it's impossible to get documents. Sometimes people haven't been had the resources to get tested before age 22. Do you have any advice for navigating that situation and effectively advocating for services in the absence of clear documentation early on in someone's life?
Well, the lawyer in me wants to say, hey, that's not fair. Because the diagnosis of ID depends on manifestation before the age, during the age of onset. It doesn't mean that it should be diagnosed before the age of onset. And so requiring those documents to me, okay, so this is not legal advice because there may be very good documentation out there saying someone has already tried this, but boy, does this sound like an equal protection problem to me. Essentially, you're splitting two classes of people differently, people who were lucky enough or wealthy enough to get the testing and people who weren't. That's not necessarily so good. Sorry, there was somebody at the door. Short of that, all I can say is shake every tree. Look for school records. Don't take no for an answer. I will give you the mitigation 30-second mitigation specialist, which I am not a mitigation specialist. They are much better than I am, but show up, keep showing up. Don't announce yourself. Ask very nicely, but be persistent. There may be more records out there than you know. At the moment, that's the best I got. I would also say contact the disability rights organization in your state and see if that helps.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll wrap up with one last question here. A couple of people asked about in working in settings with individuals that could have intellectual issues, but also are known to have or potentially have psychotic disorders, and that sometimes it's difficult to parse out intellectual disability from cognitive deficits with schizophrenia. Any recommendations or thoughts about how to assess and make sure that certain cognitive issues are specifically about an intellectual disability?
Sometimes these things just aren't separable, and sometimes they shouldn't necessarily be separable. I mean, first of all, obviously medication is an issue. So if someone is functioning much, much better when they're medicated, that's one thing. But even, and you all know this better than I do, I'm a lawyer, not a clinician, but even with medication, certain deficits that might, quote unquote, be attributable to the mental illness can persist, particularly if the illness hasn't been well treated in the past, and people are just sort of cruising along at that kind of semi-permanent level. At that point, you're not trying to parse out the difference between intellectual disability and the mental illness, because this is this person's functioning. So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's the mental illness talking versus the intellectual disability when the effect on the functioning is the same and it's not really changing. Does that make sense?
I think it's definitely an important consideration, and I really appreciate you sharing all of this with everybody. Thank you so much, Ann Delpha. This is a very important issue that people come across in a number of different correctional and forensic settings. So we're very thankful for the breadth of coverage that you gave us here. Yeah.
I'm glad you found it at least somewhat useful. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And with that, we will wrap up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next Tuesday, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.